Hi, this is Garibay, and today I want to talk specifically about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition and dungeon mastering for Gen Z, and the actual name that we should be considering Gen Z as, and how Gen Z, in my opinion, needs to be dungeon mastered in a special way. All right, so let's get into this. All right, so first and foremost, I think we have to dungeon master differently for Gen Z than we do for millennials, than we do for boomers, than we do for Gen X, than we do for and definitely than we do for the greatest generation. Okay, so that's the real key. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the greatest generation. So what is the greatest generation, and why do they have that name? So the greatest generation is the generation of Americans that lived through World War II, okay? And they were given that name, I think they were given that name by an American journalist, and that American journalist gave them that name because he said they had lived through one of the most catastrophic events in American history, and that it hardened them, right? And it kind of forged them like a sword, so that they were a really unique and special generation, right? I think he was right. I think the name The Greatest Generation is correct. However, I think Gen Z, now, and just so you're aware, The Greatest Generation had a different name before that, but now they're known as The Greatest Generation, right? Now, I think that journalist, whoever he was, he or she was, that gave them that name, it's used, it's known, it's been used lots of different places. Basically, I think he was right, or he or she was right to give that name. But now we all need to recognize Gen Z as the ultimate generation. They have surpassed the greatest generation because, in my opinion, they have experienced a much greater, much more horrific, much more tragic, much more impacting event than World War II, and that is the pandemic, okay? Now, how can I say that the pandemic is more impacting to Generation Z than World War II was to the greatest generation? Well, here we go. All right, so first of all, the greatest generation, it was a war, there was a war, but that war really never at any point significantly caused any fear that America would be invaded, right? There was a couple of skirmishes. There was some, a little bit of boots on the ground. I don't think there was ever a single boot on the ground in America. That's the issue, right? In World War II, there wasn't a single boot on the ground in America, right? And the people who went across the seas to serve, right? They saw some horrific things. It was terrible, right? But it was a distinct portion of the American generation, and it wasn't even a majority of them. It was a minority of the people who actually served in the war. And there were people who gave sacrifices here at home, but all of these things had boundaries around them, right? But Gen Z, the ultimate generation, and I think I'm the first to say this. I've never heard anybody make a call for everyone to stop referring to Generation Z. I'm making an official call to America. Here's J. Scott Garibay saying you should no longer refer to Gen Z as Gen Z. They should be referred to as the ultimate generation. And the reason why is I think they've paid the ultimate price for America. They lived through and bore the burden of COVID-19, bore the burden of the pandemic, which is, I think, far greater than what happened in World War II. So here we go, okay? So every single boy and girl and every gender in Gen Z was directly impacted by it. They didn't watch it from across the seas on a news video, right? They all had to wear the mask. Many of them lost entire a year or more of their education, right? There were cities where schools shut down and were never open the entire year, right? And many kids didn't have what they needed to go online and lost an entire year, right? And like the numbers are hundreds of thousands or low millions, right? There are go listen to any New York Times audio digest, and they will tell you They are expecting absolutely catastrophic, educational losses for this generation. They said these kids may never get back what they lost, may never get back the learning they lost. It's that deep and that significant, right? It's incredible, right? The other thing is the masks. These poor kids, right? And this is, and remember, this is Gen Z. This is not millennials. We're talking Gen Z, right? These poor kids couldn't breathe for a year. They were, more than anybody else, they were forced to wear these absolutely horrible masks. They couldn't see the smiles of their friends. They couldn't breathe freely. They had to, breathe in their own, recycled breath. It's just like they literally couldn't even breathe, right? They saw, many of them had elders who passed, grandmas and grandpas, even parents. There were kids who were completely orphaned by this, right? To tell the truth, I know World War II was very significant, right? But the reality is it was distant. It did not happen in America. The pandemic hit right at home, and it was merciless, and it did not spare a single member of Gen Z. They were all impacted deep. Some lost parents. Every single one of them lost the freedom to breathe. Literally the freedom to breathe. They lost the freedom to smile. That would be witnessed. If you smile below a mask, did it ever happen? Who knows, right? They lost the freedom to smile to their friends. They lost the freedom to hug. They lost the freedom to shake a hand. Gen Z is the ultimate generation. The ultimate generation. Yes, 100%, right? The greatest generation is the greatest generation. But Gen Z is the ultimate generation because they paid the ultimate price. That's my take, right? And here's the thing, as Dungeon Masters, we cannot treat them the same as other players, right? We have to realize that they have had traumas in their lives that we haven't had, right? And you're like, oh, well, I went through the same thing. You didn't, right? You're an adult, right? And the reality is you had resources. You had resources they didn't have. You have experience to deal with the stuff that they didn't have, right? You could just go look up what happened in 1918 and give yourself some solace because you could understand it. These Gen Zs didn't have the capacity to do that and understand what they were reading. They were alone in this, right? In many, many cases. Even when they had loving parents, they were alone, right? And I really feel they paid the ultimate price. And so when we dungeon master them at the table, we need to remember their traumas, right? So one of the things I would tell you right now, I would not be putting masked NPCs in your game, right? I would definitely make sure that the way you use gas clouds, right, and spores, it's going to be received differently by the ultimate generation. It is going to be received differently. It could be traumatic for them, right? So you want to be very careful about triggers and traumas for Gen Z, for the ultimate generation, in ways that that are going to be different than how you process those same things for people who are on how you process it for people who are of different generations, right? So the reality is, I'm firmly convinced that the greatest generation is the greatest generation, but Gen Z is the ultimate generation. And when we game master for them, we need to be very careful how we game master them. They are different, right? And we need to be more careful with them and be more respectful of the traumas that they were impacted by, right? And make sure that in our games, we're remembering how they may receive traumas when, from specific Dungeons and Dragons interactions, right? Masked NPCs, spores, poisonous gas clouds in different environments, difficult terrains of different types, right? Orphans, just even orphans, right? Like that might be a really, we have urchin in literally as a background, right? Maybe that needs to be taken out for a while, right? Like it's not as, as fun as it used to be, because the idea of children who have just absolutely catastrophic events happening around them and may have lost people who are needed to, to support them, or even just the fact that the pandemic was so catastrophic that many of these kids, even though their parents were there, their parents were so distracted, so frightened, so, having to deal with so many issues that it really transformed, how they interacted with their ability to even function, right? It's just very, very different, right? And so I would really encourage you to be very careful as you proceed, right? In dealing with the ultimate generation as you dungeon mesh for them. All that's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I know this is a cautious subject, right? Because of course we won't want to undervalue what the greatest generation did, but the reality is, when a new generation has literally suffered more trauma, I think that needs to be recognized, and I'm recognizing it. I truly believe the ultimate generation is Gen Z. The greatest generation is still the greatest generation, but the ultimate generation is Gen Z. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.